The ground was covered in snow that had blown through cracks in the walls, but it didn't matter. Sophia, the frail 6-year-old girl, sat alone on the floor clutching a photograph. Her messy brown hair fell over her face, and her torn red sweater did little to shield her from the biting cold. Her small hands shook as she traced the edges of the photo. It was all she had left of Luke, her older brother, who had been taken from her in the chaos of war. She missed him every moment, and though she clung to the memory, she could never escape the empty void in her heart. Before we begin, let me know where you are watching from. Leave your country name in the comments below. And if you love stories about courage, loyalty, and community, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. She stared at the photograph, her eyes glossed with tears, the ache of loss too much to bear. She muttered something under her breath, as if speaking to the photograph. "I don't want Candy. I want my brother back." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had been standing at the barn's entrance, watching her from a distance. Ethan, a soldier in his 40s, weary from years of battle, wore his camouflage uniform like a second skin. His face was hard and etched with the weight of all he had seen. But in that moment, standing there in the dim firelight, all the harshness of the world seemed to fade away as he looked at Sophia. He didn't know how to answer her. What words could fill that kind of emptiness? But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't leave her to bear this pain alone. Slowly, he moved closer, the soft padding of his boots on the snow-dusted floor the only sound. As he approached, Max, the loyal German Shepherd canine, lifted his head from his paws, watching the interaction carefully. Max was more than a dog, he was a protector, and, in his gaze, there was an unspoken understanding of the weight Ethan carried. Ethan knelt beside Sophia, his movements slow and gentle. Her tear-filled eyes met his, and she didn't pull away. "Sophia, Ethan began, his voice faltering as he struggled to find the right words. What could he say to a child who had lost everything, to someone so small yet bearing such a heavy heart? "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't bring him back. Your brother." Sophia didn't say anything, only looked at him with those big, sorrowful eyes, clutching the photo even tighter, her knuckles turning white. She didn't need words, she already knew. "I know you miss him," Ethan continued, his voice softening. "I miss a lot of people too, but you're not alone. I'm here and Max is here." He reached out, placing a comforting hand on Max's head. The dog gave a quiet growl, a protective sound as if to reaffirm his presence. Ethan could feel the weight of her sorrow press on him, the rawness of her grief overwhelming. He had faced so many battles, but this was different. This wasn't about fighting an enemy or surviving a war. It was about protecting something far more precious. Sophia needed a family, and Ethan had promised to keep her safe, to make sure she would not be alone. He would not let her face the world without a sense of belonging. Max, sensing the tension, gently nudged Sophia with his nose. She reached down and ran her small fingers through his fur, the warmth of the dog offering her a brief moment of comfort. The love and loyalty between them were palpable, a bond that didn't need words. "Sophia," Ethan said softly, "I can't bring him back, but I'll protect you, I promise." A silence fell over the barn. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside, as if the storm itself were waiting for the next step. Sophia sat motionless, her eyes downcast. Ethan stayed beside her, not speaking, allowing her the space to process. Then, in a soft whisper, Sophia spoke again, her voice barely above a murmur. "I just want him back, Ethan. I want to be with him." Ethan's heart shattered. He had known the world could be cruel, but seeing Sophia, so small, so broken, brought a pain that was almost unbearable. He couldn't erase her grief, but in that moment he made a vow to do whatever it took to help her heal, to show her that she mattered, even in a world that had taken so much from her. "I know, Sophia," he said quietly, brushing a lock of her messy brown hair from her face. "I know, and I'll never stop trying to make it right." Outside, the snowstorm continued to rage, but inside the barn, there was a flicker of warmth, a tiny spark of hope in the promise Ethan had made. The fire crackled softly, but the warmth it provided felt insignificant against the cold that seemed to seep into Ethan's bones. He sat beside Sophia, his gaze lost in the flickering flames. The barn, once a place of shelter, now felt like a fragile island in the middle of a brutal, unforgiving storm. Outside, the wind howled as if in mourning, and the snow kept falling, blanketing the world in a sheet of white. Sophia hadn't said much since their conversation. She sat with her knees hugged tightly to her chest, staring at the photograph of her brother Luke, the way she had been for hours. Her small face was pale, her brown eyes swollen from tears, and her red sweater, frayed and torn from the cold, clung to her fragile frame. She looked so small, as though the weight of the world had grown too much for her tiny shoulders to carry. Max lay beside her, his loyal presence offering comfort, but even the dog seemed to sense the emotional distance between them. Ethan knew he couldn't fill the void left by Luke. Nothing could. Sophia had lost so much, but he could still give her one thing: protection. He could keep her safe. The stillness was broken by Sophia's voice, so quiet that Ethan almost didn't hear her. "Tell me about Luke," she whispered, her voice small and vulnerable. Ethan blinked, taken aback by the request. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. But he saw the yearning in Sophia's eyes, the desperate need to hold on to what was left of her brother. Ethan cleared his throat, trying to find the words to honor Luke without making the pain worse. "He was brave," Ethan began, his voice thick with emotion. "Always looking out for you. He was protective, like Max." Ethan looked at the dog, who raised his head and gave a soft whine as if to agree. "Luke would never have let anything happen to you, Sophia. He would have given anything to make sure you were safe." Sophia's lips trembled as she clutched the photograph tighter, her small fingers pressing against the edges as though trying to hold on to something she couldn't touch. "I want him back, Ethan," she said, her voice breaking. "I miss him. I don't know how to keep going without him." The raw pain in Sophia's voice pierced Ethan's heart. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, that everything would get better, but he knew better than anyone that the wounds Sophia carried wouldn't heal overnight. Grief wasn't something you could simply wish away, no matter how hard you tried. "I know, Sophia," he said softly. "I wish I could take away your pain. I wish I could bring him back." He paused, unsure if his words would help or make things worse. "But I promise you this, no matter what happens, you won't be alone." Max nudged Sophia gently with his nose, and she allowed the dog to rest his head on her lap, the warmth of his fur a brief comfort against her cold hands. For a moment, the tension in the barn seemed to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, fragile peace. Ethan watched the two of them, knowing he could protect Sophia physically, but he couldn't shield her from the emotional devastation she carried. The weight of the world was on her small shoulders, and no matter how hard Ethan tried, he knew there would be moments when nothing would feel like enough. But then something unexpected happened. Sophia looked up at him with those same brown eyes, eyes that held so much pain yet also the faintest glimmer of trust. "Do you think I can ever feel happy again?" she asked, her voice so quiet it was barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, thick with sorrow, and Ethan's heart clenched in response. How could he answer her? How could he tell a child who had lost so much that joy would return when he wasn't sure he even believed it himself? Instead of answering, Ethan just gave her a small smile, though it was barely more than a twitch of his lips. He placed his hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. "One step at a time, Sophia," he said gently. "One day at a time." Max let out a soft huff, as though agreeing, and Sophia's lips curled into the smallest of smiles, barely noticeable, but it was there. It was a start. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the barn, in the quiet of the night, there was a sliver of something else, a promise. A promise of protection, a promise to stay together, a promise to try. The fire in the barn crackled low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The snowstorm outside had not relented, and the world beyond the barn felt like an endless stretch of white and ice. The wind howled like a distant, mournful cry. Inside, the air was thick with the weight of silence, only broken by the occasional whisper of Sophia or the soft growls of Max, who lay close by her side, ever vigilant. Ethan sat by the fire, staring into the dancing flames, his thoughts racing. He had promised Sophia he would protect her, but the burden of that promise was heavy, and the road ahead seemed impossibly long. He couldn't bring her brother back, couldn't fix the gaping hole in her heart. How could he possibly fill the void left by a life lost too soon? He had seen war, he had fought battles that tore men apart, battles that left scars both on the body and the soul. But nothing in his years of service had prepared him for this, the quiet grief of a child who had lost everything, a child who still clung to memories she would never fully understand, a child who, despite her pain, still trusted him to protect her, to keep her safe from the storm inside and out. Sophia sat near him, her legs drawn up to her chest, her eyes fixed on the photograph of Luke. Her face was pale, her cheeks streaked with tears, yet she remained silent. She hadn't spoken much since their conversation earlier, only occasionally glancing at Ethan or reaching out for Max, who stayed close, offering his comfort. Ethan glanced at her, feeling the growing need to do more than just promise her safety. He needed to make her feel, even if just for a moment, that the world could still be a place of warmth, of love, despite the endless cold that seemed to surround them. "Do you remember when we used to play, Sophia?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. She looked up at him, her brow furrowed. She didn't respond at first, just staring at him as though weighing his words, before her lips parted. "I remember," she whispered. "We used to play in the garden, with Luke." Ethan felt his heart tighten. He could see the images flashing in Sophia's mind of summers spent in a garden, laughter ringing through the air, a time before the world had fallen apart. Luke had been her protector, her companion, and now all that was left were the memories, fragile and fading. "That was a good time, wasn't it?" Ethan said quietly, leaning forward and placing a hand on Sophia's shoulder. "Your brother. He would have wanted you to keep those memories safe, but he also would have wanted you to keep going, to find joy even if it's hard." Sophia nodded, but her eyes filled with tears again. "I don't know how," she said softly. "I miss him so much. I just want him back." The words hit Ethan hard. What could he say to a child who had experienced such profound loss? What words could ease the agony of missing someone so deeply? But just as Ethan opened his mouth to respond, Max let out a low growl, his body stiffening. Sophia stiffened too, her eyes darting toward the barn door. Outside, the wind howled, but there was something else, something that wasn't quite right. Ethan immediately stood, his instincts kicking in. His hand moved toward the rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the barn's shadowed corners, alert for any threat. Max stood up as well, his ears perked, his growl growing louder. Sophia squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face in her knees, as if trying to block out the world. She had seen too much of it, too much of the danger. "It's all right, Sophia," Ethan said softly, moving closer to her. "Stay here, okay? I'll take care of this." His voice was firm, but there was a tenderness to it that Sophia clung to. Max growled once more, moving toward the barn door, his nose twitching. Ethan approached cautiously, eyes darting between the door and Max. The storm outside made everything unclear, the wind blowing so hard it was difficult to make out shapes in the distance. But Ethan could feel the presence of someone, something close by. His heart quickened. Whoever was out there, they were not friendly. Max stepped forward, his stance protective, his growl now a low rumble as he moved toward the door. Ethan followed him cautiously, every step calculated. He had to be careful for Sophia's sake. If something happened, she would be alone, and that was a fate he couldn't allow. As Ethan reached for the door, he glanced over his shoulder at Sophia. She was trembling, her body curled tightly in on itself. "Stay safe," he whispered, before pushing the door open slowly. The storm greeted him with force. Snow whipped into his face, obscuring his vision. The figure in the distance was barely a shadow against the storm. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice cutting through the wind. The figure didn't respond, but Max's stance softened, tail twitching just slightly. He was no longer growling, but his posture remained tense. Before Ethan could make another move, the figure stepped forward, the storm swirling around him like a cloak. The man's face was obscured by a scarf, but his eyes, dark and tired, met Ethan's. "I'm just looking for shelter," the man said, his voice hoarse but steady. "The storm is worse than I thought. I won't stay long, I swear it." Ethan hesitated, his hand still gripping the rifle. He studied the stranger closely, searching for any signs of deceit. After a long pause, Ethan spoke. "You can stay, but you don't come near her." He pointed to Sophia inside the barn. "Understand?" The man nodded, his breath visible in the cold air. "Understood." Ethan stepped aside, letting the stranger pass, but still keeping a watchful eye on him. Max stayed at his side, watching with caution. The stranger entered, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. As he stepped inside, Sophia looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with uncertainty. She hugged her knees to her chest tighter, her eyes darting from Ethan to the stranger. Ethan knelt beside her again, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "We're safe, Sophia, I promise." She didn't say anything, but her wide eyes never left the stranger. Max, sensing the tension, lowered his head but stayed close to Sophia, watching the newcomer carefully. The barn fell silent again, save for the howling wind outside and the crackling of the fire. Sophia clutched her brother's photograph tighter, as if holding on to something solid, something familiar. In that moment, Ethan made another silent promise. He would keep her safe from whatever dangers lay ahead, no matter what it took. The wind outside continued to howl as the barn creaked under the weight of the storm. Inside, the fire crackled weakly, casting flickering shadows over the three figures gathered near the warmth. Ethan, the soldier in camouflage, standing guard, Sophia, the fragile 6-year-old orphan girl, clutching her brother's photograph as if it was the only thing left that tethered her to the world, and Max, the loyal German Shepherd K9, who stayed close to Sophia, ever watchful. The stranger sat quietly by the fire, his back hunched as if he was trying to make himself smaller in the presence of the two others. His scarf, still wrapped tightly around his face, didn't reveal much, but his eyes, dark and tired, were the only parts of him visible. They seemed weary, as though they carried the weight of too many miles, too many losses. Ethan kept a cautious distance from the stranger, his gaze never straying far from him. His instincts told him to be wary, even if the man had appeared harmless. Trust wasn't something easily given, not in this world, not when survival was a daily battle. Sophia, sitting near the fire with her knees pulled close to her chest, watched the stranger with wide, uncertain eyes. Max, sensing her discomfort, shifted slightly but didn't leave her side. He was a silent protector, standing guard in ways Ethan couldn't always manage. The man spoke, his voice gruff. "I didn't mean to intrude. The storm came out of nowhere. Thought I could make it to the next town, but the wind, it's too much out there." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He was still trying to read the stranger, assessing the situation in his mind. Sophia's presence in the room, her vulnerability, weighed heavily on him. He couldn't let his guard down. Not now. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, his voice neutral, guarded. The stranger hesitated for a moment, then nodded toward Sophia. "Luke," he said quietly, before correcting himself. "I mean, it doesn't matter now. Just call me Jonas." Ethan noted the strange pause, but he didn't press. "You can stay for the night," he said, keeping his tone even. "But come morning, you'll need to leave." Jonas nodded again, his eyes flickering over to Sophia for a brief moment. The child seemed distant, her mind elsewhere. Ethan saw how she was still clutching her brother's photograph, holding on to the only piece of him left, as though doing so would somehow bring him back. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Max moved closer to Sophia, who finally broke the silence with a question, her voice soft, fragile. "Are you lost too?" she asked, her brown eyes searching Jonas's face. Jonas paused, his face unreadable, before answering. "In a way, yes. We all get lost at some point." His gaze shifted, locking on Ethan, who met his eyes without flinching. Ethan knew the stranger was hiding something. The way he avoided direct eye contact, the tension in his posture. It all pointed to the fact that there was more to his story than he was letting on. Sophia, in her innocence, didn't seem to notice, but Ethan did, and it unsettled him. "I'm not sure you'll be safe here," Jonas said after a moment, his tone more somber than it had been. "The storm's not the only thing out there. You'll need to move soon." Ethan narrowed his eyes, a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "What do you mean?" Jonas hesitated, looking at Sophia and then Max, before finally speaking. "It's not just the storm you need to worry about. There are people out there. People who don't care about the weather. They'll take what they want, no matter what. And they'll come for you too." Ethan's heart clenched. The implication was clear. There were dangers beyond the storm, beyond the physical threat of the cold and the blizzards. He had known there were still threats in this broken world, robbers, bandits, people who would do anything to survive. But hearing it from a stranger like Jonas made it feel all the more real. "Sophia, stay close to me," Ethan said, his voice firm. He didn't want to show fear in front of her, but his mind raced. What if this stranger wasn't just trying to warn them? What if he was a threat too? Jonas stood up slowly, his movements cautious, as if sensing the rising tension in the barn. He faced Ethan and nodded. "I know how it sounds, but it's the truth. You'll be safer if you leave soon. I'll help you, if you trust me." Ethan's eyes narrowed, and he stood, taking a protective step toward Sophia, who was now visibly unsettled by the stranger's words. "I don't trust anyone I don't know," Ethan said bluntly. "But we'll talk in the morning. You stay on that side of the barn tonight." Jonas didn't argue. He simply nodded, and the atmosphere between the three of them grew thick with silence again. Max's ears flicked back slightly, his eyes scanning the room for any movement, as though he too was sensing the tension. The fire crackled on, the only sound besides the occasional howl of the wind outside. Ethan sat back down, keeping Sophia close, his mind on edge. The storm outside might have been nature's fury, but the danger from men like the stranger, men who would take advantage of the world's chaos, was an even more sinister threat. Sophia, still clutching her brother's photograph, curled up beside him, her face pressed against his chest as she finally closed her eyes. The quiet of the barn with the warmth of the fire was her only comfort. Ethan stayed awake, staring into the flames, unable to shake the feeling that the storm outside was just the beginning. Max, sensing his restlessness, laid beside him, ever watchful. And in that moment Ethan made another vow, silent but unshakable. Whatever came through that door next, he would protect Sophia, even if it meant facing a danger greater than the storm. The night passed slowly, each minute dragging by with the weight of unspoken fears hanging in the air. The wind howled outside, the storm intensifying with every gust, rattling the barn's wooden beams. Inside, the fire flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the walls. Ethan sat on the cold wooden floor, his back against the wall, his rifle resting across his lap. His eyes remained fixed on the fire, though his mind never left the feeling that something was wrong. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Sophia, curled up beside him, slept fitfully, her small body trembling beneath the thin blanket that was all they had to keep warm. Her face was pale, and even in her sleep, her fingers still clutched the photograph of her brother Luke, the last piece of him she had left. Ethan's heart ached for her. He had promised to protect her, but as the hours ticked by, he couldn't help but wonder if he was enough. Max lay beside them, his body tense and alert, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow in the barn. The dog, as always, was the first to sense any danger. Even though he remained still, his ears twitched with every movement of the wind outside, his loyalty to Sophia and Ethan unwavering. Jonas, the stranger, remained on the opposite side of the barn, sitting in silence. He hadn't said much since their last conversation, and his presence had become increasingly unsettling to Ethan. His offer of help, though genuine on the surface, felt like something else, a hidden agenda. Ethan didn't trust him, Max didn't trust him, and right now that was all Ethan needed to know. The barn was quiet now, except for the distant sound of the storm and the crackling of the fire. It was a kind of uneasy peace, the kind that only came when danger loomed just outside the door, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a faint noise, a rustle near the barn door. Ethan's body tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. Max stood, his ears pinned back, growling low in his throat. "Stay here," Ethan whispered to Sophia, his voice firm. "Don't move." Sophia barely acknowledged him, her face pale with fear as she hugged her brother's photograph tighter, her eyes wide and wide awake now. She nodded without speaking, though the fear was evident in her eyes. Ethan rose to his feet, moving toward the barn door cautiously. The low growl from Max echoed in the quiet, signaling that the dog had detected something. Ethan glanced over his shoulder at Jonas, who had stood up as well, his posture stiff and uncertain. "I'll check it out," Ethan said, his voice colder than usual. "Stay back." Jonas gave a small nod, though his eyes darted nervously toward the door. As Ethan reached the barn door, he took a deep breath and slowly turned the handle, pulling the door open just enough to peek outside. The wind blasted into his face, stinging his skin, but there was no sign of anyone, just the swirling, endless snow. Max's growl deepened, and Ethan's instincts flared. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something was out there. He stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath his boots, and squinted into the storm. The world beyond the barn was an indistinct blur of white and grey, the storm creating a blanket that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of him. The air was frigid, the kind of cold that pierced to the bone. Max trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, sniffing, his body tense. He stopped suddenly, his head lifted, ears pricked, then he bolted forward, disappearing into the storm. "Max!" Ethan called out, rushing after him. But the dog was already a shadow in the snow, moving fast, tracking something or someone. He sprinted after him, his heart pounding, the snow biting at his face and hands. Max was always the one to find trouble, and tonight, it seemed, trouble had found them. Suddenly there was a shout from behind. Sophia's voice rang out in panic. "Ethan, come back, please!" The fear in her voice snapped Ethan back to reality. He spun around, his heart racing. Max was still out there, but Sophia needed him more right now. He turned and dashed back toward the barn. When he entered, Sophia was standing, her hands pressed against the cold window, peering outside, her small form trembling. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with worry. "There's someone outside," she said in a trembling voice, pointing at the window. I saw him. I saw him in the storm. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His gaze shifted to the barn door. He knew something was wrong. The stranger, Jonas, had said they would be safe, but now this? Jonas stood in the corner, his eyes narrowed, his hand resting on his pack, though he didn't move. There's someone out there, Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with concern. But it's not safe. We need to stay inside. Max returned, panting heavily, his fur damp from the snow, but no signs of an immediate threat in his posture. Ethan stood at the door, his mind racing. Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper. Who is it, Ethan? Who's out there? Ethan remained silent for a moment. He couldn't say it, couldn't explain it. Sophia had already lost so much. Telling her about the danger would only make her more afraid. I don't know, Ethan said at last. But we're not leaving tonight. We'll stay here, where it's safe. The wind outside howled louder, an unrelenting force that seemed determined to tear apart everything in its path. Ethan stood by the door, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands, eyes scanning the storm that raged outside. He could feel the weight of Sophia's anxious gaze on him, the silence between them thick with uncertainty. Max was curled up beside Sophia, his head resting in her lap, but his ears were perked, alert to every sound. The dog's quiet growls were a constant reminder that they weren't as alone as they might have hoped. Ethan's mind was racing. The stranger, Jonas, hadn't given them a clear explanation of who or what was out there in the storm. His cryptic warnings about danger didn't sit well with Ethan. Was he being honest? Or was there more to his story than he had let on? He glanced over at Jonas, who was sitting in the corner, his back against the wall, his posture tense. The man hadn't said much since their last conversation, but his eyes kept darting between Ethan and Sophia, an unsettling sense of unease lingering in the air. You can't stay here, Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. You need to leave tomorrow. I won't let anyone put Sophia in danger, and if there's a threat outside, I need to know about it. Jonas shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the wooden crate he had claimed as a seat. I didn't mean to cause trouble, he said, his voice low. But you're right. There are people out there, dangerous people. I didn't want to bring them here. Not to you. Ethan didn't trust him. Not yet. He had been in enough situations to know when someone was hiding something. There was fear in Jonas's eyes, but also something more, something that suggested he wasn't telling the whole truth. Why are they after you? Ethan pressed, his voice hardening. What are you running from? Jonas hesitated, his gaze flicking toward Sophia and then back to Ethan. He seemed to weigh his words carefully, as though deciding just how much to reveal. I don't want to drag you into this, Jonas muttered, his voice barely audible above the wind. But they're looking for me. I don't know why exactly, but they've been tracking me for days. I've been running from them for a while. Ethan's heart sank. The implication was clear. Jonas wasn't just some stranger seeking refuge from the storm. He was a man on the run, a man with enemies, and those enemies were getting closer. What do they want? Ethan asked, his voice cold and sharp. Jonas's face darkened. I don't know. I think they think I have something they need. But I've told them everything I know, and it's not much. I'm just trying to survive. The storm outside seemed to pause for a moment, the wind holding its breath as though waiting for the next revelation. I can't protect you from them, Jonas, Ethan said, his voice low. But I will protect Sophia. If you bring danger to her, I'll make sure you leave. Jonas nodded, but his eyes were filled with something more than just fear now. There was regret, deep and lingering. He knew, just as Ethan did, that the danger was not only outside the barn, it was also inside in the very space they shared between the two men who had become reluctant allies, and in the heart of the little girl whose trust was fragile, yet fierce. Sophia had been listening quietly, her small body curled in on itself, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. She had heard the words, and though she didn't fully understand the danger, she could feel the shift in the air. Something was wrong. "Ethan," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. "Is he going to hurt us?" Ethan froze at the question, his chest tightening. He looked at Jonas, whose expression softened when he met Sophia's gaze. For a moment, Jonas seemed to wrestle with himself as though wanting to explain, to make it clear that he wasn't a threat. But how could Ethan trust him? Jonas stood slowly, his eyes still on Sophia, and took a step forward as though trying to assure the girl. "No, I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly. "I promise. I've just been running from people who want to hurt me, and I didn't want to bring that danger to you." Ethan didn't move. He watched Jonas, still unsure of whether he could believe the stranger's words. "Are you sure?" Sophia's voice was barely audible. "I'm scared." Ethan knelt beside Sophia, his hand on her shoulder, trying to offer her the reassurance he wasn't sure he could give himself. "It's okay, Sophia," he said, his voice soft. "You're safe here. I won't let anyone hurt you, I promise." The wind howled again, and the snow outside continued to fall, the storm unforgiving. The barn was their only refuge, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it was becoming more of a trap with each passing hour. There were dangers beyond the storm, dangers that could tear apart everything they had left. Max growled softly, his eyes fixed on Jonas, and Ethan could feel the tension between them, thick and palpable. Jonas took a few steps back, his gaze now shifting between Ethan and Sophia, before he spoke again, his voice low and serious. "I won't bring any more trouble here, but you should leave before they come," he said. "You're safe for now, but not for long. The storm won't last forever, and neither will the safety this barn provides." The warning hung in the air, and Ethan felt his heart pound in his chest. Time was running out. The fire in the barn flickered, casting long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the walls. Ethan sat still, his rifle resting at his side, his thoughts swirling in a storm of their own. Jonas's warning echoed in his mind. Time was running out. The stranger's words about danger outside were heavy, but it was the fear in Sophia's eyes that weighed on him the most. He glanced at her now, her small frame curled tightly against Max, the dog's body providing a fragile shield of comfort. Sophia had been so strong since they met, but the cracks were showing. She was just a child. How much could she endure? Ethan let out a breath, his hand running over his face. He had made a promise to Sophia, and he would keep it. He would protect her at all costs, but what was the cost of that promise? Was he enough to keep her safe? Would anyone be? The storm outside had intensified, and though the barn walls kept the worst of the wind at bay, there was no mistaking that they were trapped in this isolated space. There was no guarantee of safety, not in this broken world. "I think they're coming, Ethan," Jonas said quietly from across the barn, his voice low, eyes scanning the windows for any movement. "The people I've been running from. They're close." Ethan stood, the tension in his muscles palpable. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. Jonas might be telling the truth, but he still couldn't fully trust him. He was a man with secrets, and Sophia's safety was paramount. If Jonas was a threat, Ethan had to act fast. "What do you suggest we do?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp. He wasn't asking out of concern for the stranger's well-being, but out of necessity. Every minute they spent in indecision brought them closer to danger. Jonas paused, his gaze darting from Ethan to Sophia. The silence was thick with the weight of the question. Jonas knew that Ethan was making the decision for both of them. "Get out of here. Leave now while you still can," he said, standing up and moving toward Ethan, his voice urgent. "If you stay, you'll be caught. They'll find you eventually. You need to move while there's still time." Ethan looked at him, his mind working quickly. Max stood at his side, and Sophia had stood up too, clutching her brother's photograph like it was a lifeline. Ethan's heart ached as he watched her, her small face full of fear and confusion. "Sophia," Ethan began, crouching down to her level. "We may have to leave soon. It's not safe here anymore. We might need to go on the move." Sophia nodded slowly, but there was no mistaking the terror in her eyes. "Will we be safe, Ethan?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's heart broke. "I'll make sure you're safe. No matter what happens, I'll protect you." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure if he believed them. Max barked once, his ears perking up. The dog's sudden alertness sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Something was happening outside. Ethan's instincts flared, and he motioned for Sophia to stay close. He grabbed his rifle, keeping a tight hold as he moved toward the barn door. "Stay behind me," he told Sophia, his voice low but firm. She nodded, clutching Max's collar for comfort. Jonas followed, but Ethan didn't take his eyes off the door. He didn't fully trust the stranger, but right now they were in this together. There were no other options. The door creaked as Ethan slowly pushed it open, the wind biting at his exposed skin as the storm raged outside. The world beyond was a blur of white, the visibility near zero. Max stood at the threshold, his body tense, growling softly as if sensing something in the storm. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, barely visible through the snow. The figure moved with purpose, its silhouette growing clearer with each passing second. "It's them," Jonas said, his voice tight. "They've found us." Ethan's heart raced as the figure came closer, the wind muffling any sound. He stepped outside, but the snow was too thick to see anything beyond a few feet. Max stepped ahead of him, his growl growing louder as the figure drew nearer. The figure stopped abruptly and called out, his voice cutting through the storm. "We know you're in there! Come out now!" Ethan's hand tightened around the rifle. The voice was familiar, a voice he didn't want to hear again. He knew these men. They were part of a group that had raided the village he had been stationed at months ago. They were merciless, and they had no qualms about hurting anyone in their way. "Get back inside," Ethan ordered sharply, grabbing Sophia and pulling her toward the back of the barn. Jonas didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Ethan and the door. "They won't stop, Ethan. I've been running from them for too long. It's only a matter of time before they break down that door." Ethan looked at Jonas, his hand on the rifle. The tension between them was palpable. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind a chaotic force that echoed the turmoil in his chest. He had to make a choice. Fight or flee? "We're not running," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "I won't let them take you, Sophia." Max let out a low bark, and Ethan knew what he had to do. There was no time left to hesitate. The stranger had brought this danger with him, but Ethan couldn't let Sophia face it alone. "Max," Ethan whispered, "stay close." The air outside the barn was frigid, a biting cold that cut through Ethan's clothes as he moved toward the entrance. His fingers were numb from the chill, but his grip on the rifle was unyielding. Every instinct told him to protect Sophia, to shield her from whatever danger had followed them here. But Ethan knew there would be no easy escape from this. Not anymore. The storm raged with full force, howling through the snowflakes like a wild beast, making everything appear hazy, indistinct. Yet there was no mistaking the figures that were now closing in, their outlines gradually emerging from the swirling snow. Max growled again, more forcefully this time, his muscles tense, his eyes locked on the approaching men. Sophia had backed away into the shadows, her small body trembling as she clung tightly to the photograph of her brother, as if the last piece of her past could somehow protect her. Ethan could see her in his peripheral vision, but he knew he couldn't focus on her now. The danger was too immediate, too real. "Stay back, Sophia," Ethan said, his voice low and steady as he moved to shield her further behind him. Jonas stood beside him, though his body was tense, eyes scanning the snowstorm for any movement. He wasn't armed, but there was a resigned look in his eyes. He knew what was coming, just as Ethan did. The figures continued to approach, and Ethan braced himself for the confrontation. They were getting closer, moving with purpose, the heavy crunch of boots in the snow growing louder in the storm's howling wind. "Ethan!" one of the figures called out from the darkness, his voice unmistakable. "We know you're in there. Come out now, and you won't regret it." Ethan's heart raced. The voice belonged to one of the raiders from the village he had once protected. These men were ruthless. He had seen them at their worst. They had no qualms about killing, and he knew that Sophia would be in grave danger if they got their hands on her. The voice called again, closer this time. "We've been tracking you. There's nowhere left to run." Max growled louder now, his body low to the ground, preparing to charge. The dog was ready, his instincts honed, to protect his pack, but Ethan knew that charging into the storm was a dangerous gamble. He needed a plan. "We're not going anywhere," Ethan said, his voice steady, almost challenging. His eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, blocking Sophia from view as best he could. "But if you want to make it out of here alive, you'll turn around and leave." A laugh echoed from the storm, cold and mirthless. The figure paused just out of range of the barn door. "You're out of your depth, soldier. This isn't your fight anymore. Let's make this easy. Come out now." Ethan gripped his rifle tighter, his mind working fast. He couldn't afford a full-on confrontation. They would be outnumbered and outgunned, but he couldn't let them have Sophia either. He had one option, and it was risky. Without taking his eyes off the figures, Ethan gave a subtle signal to Jonas. The man stiffened, but nodded almost imperceptibly. He had been running from these men for long enough to know they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Jonas turned to Max, the dog's attention momentarily shifting to him. Ethan felt a moment of tension. Jonas wasn't exactly a trusted ally, but he had proven his value. He would have to trust him now. "I'll lead them away," Jonas said in a low voice. "You take care of Sophia." The words felt like a weight in Ethan's chest. It wasn't that he didn't trust Jonas, but sending him out into the storm, into the unknown dangers of these men, felt like a betrayal. Jonas had already been through so much, but Ethan knew there was no time to second-guess. "I'll make sure she's safe," Ethan responded, though his voice was strained. He gave Jonas a hard look, his face set. "Stay alive. Come back if you can." Jonas nodded once, then turned, disappearing into the storm. Ethan watched him go, a silent prayer in his heart that the man would return. As Ethan turned to face the door, Sophia stepped forward, her voice small but determined. "Ethan," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't want you to go. Please don't leave me." The weight of her plea hit him like a punch to the gut. Ethan kneeled down in front of her, lifting her chin gently so their eyes met. "Sophia, I won't leave you. I promise. I'm going to make sure you're safe. You just have to trust me, okay?" She nodded slowly, her small hands clutching the photograph tighter, but the trust in her eyes was evident. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she understood that Ethan was her protector. "Stay inside. Lock the door if you can," Ethan said. "Max will be right here." Max stood, moving closer to Sophia as though reassuring her. The dog's presence was a small comfort in a world filled with so much danger. Ethan gave Sophia one last look before he turned and stepped back into the storm. The cold hit him immediately, a biting force that numbed his skin, but his focus was clear. He had to protect Sophia, and Max would ensure they both stayed safe. As Ethan made his way through the snow, the figures outside grew clearer. The raiders had moved closer, and he could see their weapons glinting in the faint light. They were determined, and they had no plans of retreating. But Ethan wasn't going to back down, not now, not ever. He took a deep breath and stepped forward into the blizzard, his rifle held firmly, ready to face whatever came next.